Claude responded. Dr. Valentina Reyes had been chief of pediatrics at Harrowfield Children's Medical Center for 11 months when the intake nurse, a calm and efficient woman named Priya Mehta, handed her a chart at 2:47 in the morning and said, "Infant, 4 months, respiratory distress. Mother is in the family bay asking for the attending." I took the chart. Room 4, male infant, 4 months old. Tachypneic. Oxygen saturation at 88 on room air. And then I looked at the name printed in the top right corner of the intake form, the name of the responsible party, the mother. Daniela Reyes Coburn, my sister. I had not seen Daniela in 3 years, not since our mother's birthday dinner, where she had leaned across the table and told me in front of 6 people that I had wasted my life. I stood in the corridor outside room 4 with the chart open in my hands, and I allowed myself exactly 4 seconds. I counted them. Then I pushed the door open. She was sitting in the chair beside the gurney, holding her son against her chest, rocking forward and back with that particular rhythm that mothers discover on their own in the first months and never have to be taught. She looked up when I entered. Her face was pale and streaked, her hair unwashed, her coat on inside out. She did not recognize me at first. I was in scrubs, a white coat, my badge clipped at the lapel. She looked at my face the way you look at a stranger's, searching for whether this person is going to help you. Then she recognized me. Her mouth opened. She said nothing. I said, "I'm Dr. Reyes, tell me when his breathing changed." The chief made the call. "Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you have ever been told you would never amount to anything by someone who should have believed in you, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. And if you have ever stayed quiet while you built something extraordinary, just so the moment of truth could arrive exactly on your terms, stay with me. Because that is the story I am about to tell you. But to understand why that moment in room 4 meant what it did, why I could stand at the foot of that gurney with my hands steady, and my mind completely clear while my sister stared at me like I was a hallucination, I have to take you back. 22 years back. To a kitchen table in Fresno, California, where a 17-year-old girl was told, plainly and without apology, that her dreams were a luxury the family could not afford. I was 17 when my father died. He had worked for 21 years as a civil engineer for the city, and he left behind a life insurance payout of $94,000, a modest house with a mortgage, and 4 children: my brother Ernesto, 23, my sister Daniela, 20, my sister Camilla, 14, and me. My mother, Rosa Reyes, was a woman of deep love and profound anxiety. She had emigrated from Guadalajara at 19, built a life alongside my father with deliberate and relentless effort, and when he died, she did what she knew how to do: she organized. She sat us down at the kitchen table 3 weeks after the funeral and she told us what the money was going to do. The mortgage, the car, Camilla's braces, Ernesto's truck repair. And then she listed the remainder, $24,000, which she said would go into savings for the family. I raised my hand. I was 17. I still raised my hand at the kitchen table. I said I had been accepted to the pre-medicine pipeline program at California State University, Fresno. I said the program had identified me as a candidate for an accelerated track. I said I needed the family's help with the first year's costs, approximately $8,400, because my scholarship covered tuition but not housing, supplies, or the summer lab intensive. My mother looked at Ernesto. Ernesto said, "Val, you can't be a doctor, you know how long that takes." I said I knew exactly how long it took. Daniela said, "Who's going to help with Camilla while mom's working? You're going to go live in a dorm and we're supposed to just figure it out." I said Camilla was 14, not 4. My mother said, "Valentina, I need you here." That was all she said: "I need you here." Not, "Your dream is impossible." Not, "You're not smart enough," just, "I need you here." And the way she said it, with that particular exhaustion in her voice that is the exclusive property of women who have carried too much for too long, it was designed to make the conversation end. It did end. I sat at that table for another hour while my mother and Ernesto and Daniela discussed the savings, and I did not speak again. But I was not done. 2 weeks later, I went to the office of my high school guidance counselor, a methodical and kind man named Gerald H. Wang, who had been the one to identify me for the pipeline program in the first place. I sat across from him, and I told him what had happened at the table. He listened without interrupting. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder and set it in front of me. "There are 11 external scholarships and 2 emergency grant programs in here," he said. "None of them require family financial disclosure. You fill out the applications. I will write every letter you need." I took the folder home. I did not tell my mother. Daniela came into my room 2 nights later while I was at my desk with the applications spread out in front of me. She stood in the doorway and looked at the papers. "What are you doing?" she said. "Homework," I said. She stood there for another moment. Then she said, "Mom is serious, Val. She needs help with Camilla. You're not going off to play doctor." I did not respond. I kept my pen moving. She said, "You're being selfish, you know that, right? Dad's barely in the ground and you're already thinking about yourself." That sentence landed. I will not pretend it did not. I felt it move through me the way cold water moves through the body when you are not expecting it, a systemic shock, not just a surface sting. I kept writing. My handwriting did not change. My grip on the pen did not tighten, but I felt it. She left the doorway. I finished the applications. I wrote down the name of the pipeline program on a separate piece of paper that night, the full name. The California Health Sciences Pre-Medical Bridge Program, Fresno Cohort. I folded that piece of paper and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. The family did not contribute a single dollar to my education. The $94,000 from my father's life insurance, the money that was supposed to be the foundation of something, went to things I was never fully told about. By the time I asked directly, 2 years later, Ernesto told me $24,000 remained. Then, at another dinner, $11,000. Then it was gone. No explanation, no accounting. I stopped asking. What I had instead, a $4,200 merit scholarship from the pipeline program, a $2,800 emergency grant from the Gertrude Hollies Foundation for first-generation medical students, a $1,100 prize from a statewide biology competition I had entered on Gerald H. Wang's recommendation, a part-time job at a hospital supply company in Fresno that paid $11.4 an hour and let me handle sterile packaging equipment and learn, in a small and peripheral way, what the interior systems of a hospital actually looked like. It was not enough. It was close to enough. That is a different thing entirely. In my second semester at Fresno State, I was $1,700 short of what I needed to cover the remaining lab fees, and my share of the apartment I split with 2 other students, a bioengineering major named Tomás Aguilar and a nursing student named Becca Sorrentino. I was 20 years old. I had a 3.94 GPA. I had a letter of recommendation from Dr. Patricia Wu at Fresno State's biology department that she later told me was the strongest she had written in 11 years of teaching. I had a part-time job. I had $11 in checking and $340 in a savings account I did not touch. I applied to the campus emergency financial aid office. They reviewed the application. They denied it on the grounds that my documented expected family contribution exceeded the threshold for emergency eligibility. The form assumed my family would help. My family had already taken what was mine and distributed it without telling me where it went. I sat in the hallway outside the financial aid office for a long time, not crying. I want to be precise about that. I was not crying. I was calculating. I was trying to figure out which of my 3 part-time shifts I could expand, how many hours per week I could add before my GPA dropped below 3.8, what a 3.8 would do to my pipeline program standing. Then Dr. Patricia Wu found me. I do not know what I looked like in that hallway, but she sat down beside me without asking and said, "What happened?" I told her about the denial. I did not tell her about my family. I said I was $1,700 short and the appeal window was 14 days. She said, "The department has a discretionary research assistant fund. It's competitive, but you're already first on my list. I'll have an answer for you in 5 days." 4 days later, she left a note in my campus mailbox. The amount was $2,100, more than I needed, enough that I could breathe for the first time in 4 months. I want to tell you something about Dr. Patricia Wu. She never mentioned it again, not once. She treated me exactly as she had treated me before, with rigorous professional respect and high expectations. She wrote me into a study on pediatric respiratory pathogens that she was co-conducting with Harrowfield Children's Medical Center, 40 miles away. That was the first time I set foot in the building where I would, 20 years later, be named chief. I did not know that then. I did not know anything except that I was being trusted with real research, and that I was going to be worthy of it. My family's contact with me during this period was intermittent and instrumental. My mother called on birthdays and holidays. Daniela called when she needed something, to be talked through a conflict with her boyfriend, to borrow our grandmother's mole recipe, Once to ask whether I thought it was normal that she was nauseous in the mornings because she and her boyfriend had been careless. I helped each time. I did not tell any of them about the research study. I did not tell them about Dr. Wu's grant. I did not tell them about the paper. There was a paper. In the spring of my junior year, Dr. Wu submitted our study findings to the Journal of Pediatric Pulmonology. The paper was titled Respiratory Syncytial Virus Seasonality and Early Intervention Outcomes in Pediatric Populations, a Regional Analysis. I was the third listed author. I was 21 years old. It was published in March, 14 months after we began the study. I bought a copy of the journal issue from the university library and held it in my hands for a long time. I thought about calling my mother. I thought about what she would say. I thought about the kitchen table and Ernesto's voice and Daniela in my doorway telling me I was selfish. I did not call. I put the journal in my backpack and I walked to the lab and I kept working. My mother called that Sunday. She wanted to know if I was coming home for Easter. She did not ask about school. I said I was on call that weekend for a lab protocol. She said that was a shame. She said Daniela was pregnant and they were going to have a small celebration. I congratulated her and told her to give Daniela my love. My mother said, "You know, Valentina, your sister is really stepping up. She's going to need help with the baby. You're the practical one. You could work at the clinic on Tulare Street and still be nearby." I said, "I'll think about it." I had no intention of thinking about it. 4 years of undergraduate, a 3.96 GPA at graduation, a strong score on my MCAT, and one published research paper as a named author, that was what I carried into my medical school applications. I applied to 12 programs. I was accepted to 9. I chose the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine. My mother did not come to my undergraduate graduation. Daniela was 7 months pregnant. Camilla was in high school and had a performance that weekend. Ernesto said he had a work shift he couldn't move. Gerald H. Wang came. He drove 2 hours. He sat in the 4th row and when they called my name he stood up and he clapped. I looked at his face when I walked across that stage and I thought, this is enough. This has to be enough, and it was. It was. Medical school was not the place where I broke. I want to say that clearly because stories like mine are sometimes told as though the protagonist is perpetually on the verge of collapse, perpetually one scene away from surrendering, and that is not accurate. I was not on the verge. I was tired, consistently and sometimes profoundly, but tired is not the same as broken. I had studied how to be tired. I had been practicing since I was 17. What I did not know how to do yet was navigate the particular loneliness of being the only person in a room who was building something with no one watching. At UCSF, I was surrounded by people who had families who watched. Families who called after every exam. Families who flew in for the white coat ceremony and cried at appropriate moments and took photographs. My white coat ceremony was attended by Dr. Patricia Wu, who drove up from Fresno specifically, and Tomás Aguilar, who had transferred to UC Berkeley for his graduate program and took BART to the ceremony in a jacket he had borrowed from someone. Those 2 people. I wore my white coat home to the apartment I shared with 2 other first-year students, a woman named Daria Volkov, who was studying internal medicine, and a man named James Okonkwo, who would later become one of the most respected cardiologists at Stanford Medical Center, and I hung it on the back of my door. Then I sat on my bed and I allowed myself something I had not allowed in a very long time. I cried, not from sadness, or not entirely from sadness. From a species of release that doesn't have a clean name, the feeling of something enormous pressing outward from inside you after years of compression. I cried for about 7 minutes. Then I washed my face and opened my pathophysiology textbook and began reading Chapter 9, Respiratory Mechanics in Pediatric Patients. That chapter would become, in ways I could not then predict, the foundation of everything. Medical school, residency, fellowship, these are the years that most people in my profession describe as formative. I find that word too gentle. These years were excavating. They took everything I thought I was and dug past it to find out what was underneath. What was underneath, it turned out, was someone who was precise under pressure and unusually calm in pediatric emergency situations, particularly respiratory emergencies, and who had a capacity for pattern recognition in infant presentations that my residency director at UCSF Medical Center, Dr. Leonard Ashworth, called, in his written evaluation at the end of my 3rd year, Among the strongest clinical instincts I have observed in a resident in 15 years of directing this program. I did not send that evaluation to my family. I should explain where I completed my residency and fellowship, because the geography matters. I did my pediatric residency at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, 3 years, 2006 through 2009. Then, a 2-year pediatric pulmonology fellowship at the same institution. Then I was recruited as a junior attending physician at Harrowfield Children's Medical Center, which is in a suburb of Sacramento, the same facility where I had first set foot as a 20-year-old research assistant on Dr. Wu's RSV study. When I arrived at Harrowfield as an attending physician in the fall of 2011, I was 30 years old. I had $67,000 in student loan debt. I had a studio apartment I rented month to month. I had a salary of $164,000 per year, which was more money than my father had made in any year of his working life, and which I spent the first several months being quietly astonished by. I had no significant assets. I had no relationships. I had the journal article from my junior year, 2 additional peer-reviewed publications from my residency, and a reputation, small but established, in pediatric respiratory medicine. I did not call home when I signed my attending physician contract. I did not post it on social media. I did not send a card. There was a woman at Harrowfield named Dr. Simone Beaumont, a senior attending in the pediatric ER who had been there for 14 years when I arrived. She was 51, from New Orleans originally, the kind of physician who remembered every patient by face rather than chart number, and who ran morning rounds with the efficiency of someone who had stopped being impressed by difficulty. She looked at me on my first day and said, "You're the one Ashworth recommended. He said you're going to be trouble." I said, "Is that bad?" She said, "Only for the people who aren't paying attention." We became, over the years that followed, the kind of professional allies that people who have not worked in medicine sometimes struggle to categorize. Not friends exactly, though we were friendly. Not mentor and mentee, though she knew more than me and shared it without condescension. Something more specific than either. 2 physicians who had each built their competence without the particular cushion of external validation, who recognized that quality in each other, and decided, without ever saying so directly, to watch each other's backs. Dr. Simone Beaumont was the first person at Harrowfield who knew my full story. I told her in pieces, over 3 years, never as a confession but always as context, a reference to why I didn't attend a family event, a mention of why I structured my finances the way I did, a note about why I had named Dr. Patricia Wu and Gerald H. Wang as my emergency contacts rather than any family member. By the time she had all the pieces, she said, "You know what that is? That's people failing at the specific thing they were supposed to be your experts in. Your mother failed at believing in her child. Your sister failed at being someone's sibling. Those aren't small failures." I told her I had stopped needing them to succeed at those things. She looked at me with the particular expression she used when she thought someone was being more composed than was strictly necessary. I said, "I mean it." She said, "I know you do, that's what I'm looking at." In April of 2018, Dr. Marcus Holloway, the chief of pediatrics at Harrowfield Children's Medical Center, announced that he would be stepping down at the end of the calendar year to accept a position at a research institute in Boston. The department head position would be filled through a formal search process conducted by the hospital's executive team, in consultation with a retained physician search firm called Caldwell Fenn Medical Search Partners. I had been at Harrowfield for 7 years. I was 37 years old. I had published 14 peer-reviewed papers, 9 of them in my primary domain of pediatric pulmonology and respiratory emergency medicine. I had been named to the American Academy of Pediatrics Distinguished Clinician roster in 2016. I had supervised 63 residents. I had been the lead physician on a protocol revision for infant respiratory distress that had been adopted by 4 hospital systems in California. I submitted my application for the chief position on a Tuesday evening in May, from my office, after everyone else had gone home. I sat at my desk in the dark for a while after I hit send. The window faced north, toward the parking structure, and the lights from the structure made orange rectangles on the ceiling. I thought about calling Tomas. I thought about calling Dr. Wu. I thought about calling Simone, who was 3 offices down the hall. I did not call anyone. I turned off my desk lamp and I drove home and I made dinner and I went to bed. What happened between May and December of 2018 I will condense. A 6-month search process, 2 formal interview rounds, a presentation to the hospital executive team, a reference verification period during which Dr. Leonard Ashworth called Harrowfield Search Committee and reportedly spoke for 40 minutes without being asked a second question, and a final committee vote. Letter actually arrived on paper by courier, which I had not expected, on December 11, 2018. I signed for it in the lobby. I took the elevator up to the 4th floor. I walked into my office. I opened the envelope. I read the letter once. Then I folded it and put it in the inside pocket of my coat, directly against my chest. I walked down the hall to Simone's office and knocked. She looked up. I said, "It's done." She said, "Tell me." I said, "Chief of Pediatrics." She stood up. She crossed the room, and she put both hands on my shoulders, and she looked me directly in the face, and she said, "Your father would have known you were going to do this the day you were born." I did not cry in Harrowfield Children's Medical Center that day. I cried in my car, in the parking structure, with the letter still folded against my chest and the orange light coming through the windshield. I cried for a long time. I thought about the kitchen table in Fresno. I thought about the $94,000. I thought about the folded paper in my wallet that I had kept for 6 years. I thought about Gerald H. Wang standing up in the 4th row. I thought about my sister in my doorway, telling me I was selfish. She had no idea what I had become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. I became Chief of Pediatrics at Harrowfield Children's Medical Center on January 6, 2019. My title was official. My department was 31 physicians, 17 nurse practitioners, and a support staff of 44. My office had a window that faced the courtyard, where there was a magnolia tree that bloomed in February regardless of the temperature, a reliable and slightly miraculous thing that I found privately steadying. There were things I needed to do in the first year that I had not anticipated. Not clinical things, the clinical work I knew. Administrative things. The kind of institutional architecture that operates below the surface of what patients see. Contract reviews, staffing models, the renegotiation of our department's health insurance, coverage agreements with 3 major carriers, a dispute with the hospital's billing department over how our specialist appointment coding was being entered in the electronic medical records system. That dispute cost our department approximately $43,000 in reclassified reimbursements over a 6-month period before I identified it. I retained outside counsel for the billing dispute. The attorney I worked with was a woman named Margaret Osibonsu of the firm Pryor, Callahan, and Osibonsu, a healthcare contracts specialist who had worked with 4 major hospital systems in California and who took exactly 11 minutes in our first meeting to understand what had happened with the medical records coding and tell me what she was going to do about it. She recovered $38,700 for the department. She charged $4,200 for her time. I considered that a sound exchange. Simone said, "Where did you find her?" I said, "She was a reference from the hospital's legal team. I verified her independently." Simone said, "You verified your own hospital's attorney." I said, "I verify everything." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I know." The billing dispute was resolved by October of 2019. By December, I had restructured our specialist appointment scheduling system, reducing average wait time from 11 days to 4. I had expanded our pediatric pulmonology team by 2 full-time physicians, Dr. Amara Johansson, who came to us from Seattle Children's Hospital, and Dr. Kevin Patel, a recent fellowship graduate from Johns Hopkins. I had overseen the rollout of a new electronic medical records interface for the department that reduced documentation time per encounter by an average of 18 minutes. I was 38 years old. I was, by any reasonable professional measure, exactly where I had intended to be. I had a financial advisor, a woman named Celia Park of Meridian Wealth Partners in Sacramento, who had been helping me direct my earnings since 2014, into retirement savings, into a modest investment property I had purchased in Elk Grove in 2016, into indexed funds that had grown with the kind of quiet reliability I had always found more comforting than dramatic returns. I had paid off my student loans in full in March of 2020, 5 years ahead of schedule. I did not celebrate. I moved the monthly payment amount directly into my brokerage account. My family called occasionally. My mother, whose health had begun to decline slowly, A diagnosis of type 2 diabetes in 2017, managed, stable but a source of steady low-grade worry, called on holidays and sometimes on random Tuesday evenings when she felt like talking. I always answered. We talked about ordinary things. She did not ask about my work in any specific way. I did not offer specifics. Daniela had 2 children now, her eldest, Marcus, who was 12, and her infant son, born in October of 2022, whom she had named Daniel after our father with a slight variation, a gesture that I found unexpectedly moving when I heard it. She and her husband, Craig Coburn, lived in Elk Grove, which is, and I recognized this fact when I learned it without allowing myself to make too much of it, 17 minutes from my investment property. I had not told Daniela where I lived or worked. She had not asked. That was where things stood in the autumn of 2022. My department was running well. My team was strong. Simone was retiring at the end of the year and had recommended me, through 3 separate informal conversations with hospital leadership, as the person whose institutional read on the department should be the primary reference point going forward. I was 39. I had adjusted my age upward to account for my birthday in September, sitting in a position I had built from a kitchen table and a folded piece of paper and a manila folder in a guidance counselor's office. And then, on a Thursday morning in November, the referral coordinator for our pediatric pulmonology team brought me a specialist appointment request that had come through the hospital's network intake system. Infant patient, 4 months old. Referred from a pediatric primary care clinic in Elk Grove for evaluation of recurring respiratory symptoms. The referring physician's name was Dr. Angela Domings. The child's name was Daniel Reyes Coburn. The insurance policy on the intake form was listed under Craig Coburn. I stood in the corridor holding that referral slip for a long time, long enough that a passing resident asked if I was all right. I told her I was reviewing a chart. I kept my voice exactly as it always was. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. I gave the referral to Dr. Amara Johansson. I noted in the internal system that I had a personal conflict of interest with the family and could not be the attending of record. I did not explain. I did not have to explain. Dr. Johansson took the case without comment, as the professional she was. And I went back to my office and I sat at my desk and I looked at the magnolia tree in the courtyard and I thought, Daniela's infant son has a respiratory condition. He has been referred to my department. He is going to be seen by my physician in my building and my sister is never going to know I am here. For a while that felt like something I had managed. A near miss, cleanly handled. A professional decision, correctly made, but that was November. In February, at 2:47 in the morning, Priya Mehta handed me the chart in the corridor outside the pediatric emergency department, where I was covering the overnight because one of my attending physicians had called in sick, and we were short-staffed. A thing that happens in every hospital regardless of how well it is run. And the name in the top right corner was Daniela Reyes Coburn, and the patient was a 4-month-old infant in respiratory distress, and I pushed open the door of room 4. My sister looked up. I was already reading the chart. Claude responded. Her son's oxygen saturation was 88. Her son's oxygen saturation was 88. That number was the only thing in the room that mattered. I said, tell me when his breathing changed. Daniela's mouth was still open. She was trying to reconcile what she was seeing me here in this room, in this coat, with whatever version of my life she had maintained in her head over the past 3 years. That version, I was reasonably confident, did not include chief of anything. I said, Daniela, when did his breathing change? She closed her mouth. She looked at her son and then back at me and something shifted in her face, the mother overriding the sister, which was the right instinct and the one I was counting on. She said, about 2 hours ago. He's had a cold for 4 days. RSV, they said at the clinic. But tonight he started working so hard. His chest was moving like it was being pulled in, I said. Yes, subcostal retractions, I said to Priya, who was already documenting. Let's get a repeat sat with supplemental oxygen, 2 liters by nasal cannula. I want a chest x-ray, and I want respiratory therapy here in the next 8 minutes. Priya said, already paged. I moved to the bedside. Little Daniel Reyes Coburn was 4 months old and he had his mother's forehead and his grandfather's name and he was working very hard to breathe. I examined him with the efficiency that 11 months as a chief and the preceding 12 years as a clinician had built into my hands: auscultation, observation of work of breathing, assessment of color and tone and responsiveness. He was alert. He tracked my face when I moved. That was good. He was tired, though. You learn to read infant fatigue at a cellular level when you have done this long enough, and this child was tired. I straightened. I made 3 notations on the chart. I said to Daniela, in the same voice I used for every family in this situation. His presentation is consistent with RSV bronchiolitis with moderate respiratory distress. His oxygen levels are low, which is why he's working so hard. We're going to support him with supplemental oxygen, monitor his response, and make a decision about admission based on how he does in the next hour. He's alert and responding well. That's what we want to see. Daniela said, is he going to be okay? I said, I'm going to take excellent care of him. She looked at me when I said that, not at my coat, at my face. And for a moment, one very specific and completely unplanned moment, she looked exactly the way she had looked when we were children, and she was the older one, and I was the one who was frightened of something, and she was the one who was supposed to know what to do. I held her gaze for exactly as long as it took to confirm that I meant what I had said. Then I turned and walked out of room 4, and I did not stop moving. What happened with Daniel that night is not the story. He responded to supplemental oxygen within 40 minutes. His saturation climbed to 96 by the time the pediatric respiratory therapist, a careful and competent man named Roy Castillo, had completed the second assessment. I admitted him to the pediatric unit for monitoring, which was the correct clinical decision, and he was discharged home 2 days later in good condition with a follow-up specialist appointment scheduled with Dr. Amara Johansson. He was fine. He was going to be fine. What happened next is the story. Daniela did not say anything to me that first night about the fact of who I was. She was too focused on her son, which was as it should be. On the second day, when Daniel was stable and sleeping, and the worst of the fear had passed, Craig Coburn arrived, a wide man with a careful handshake and the look of someone who managed his anxiety through logistics, and they sat together in the family room at the end of the pediatric unit hallway, and one of the floor nurses came to my office and told me that the family was asking to speak with the attending physician in charge of the case. The attending of record was Dr. Johansson. I was the chief. I sent Dr. Johansson. She came back 20 minutes later and sat down across from my desk and said, they're asking specifically about you. They know your name from the emergency department intake sheet. They want to know what your role is. I said, what did you tell them? She said, that you're the chief of pediatrics and that their son's care is in excellent hands. I said, that's correct. Is there a clinical question? She looked at me with the careful expression of someone who has decided not to ask the question behind the question. No, she said. No clinical question. I said, then I think we're all right. She stood. At the door she paused and said, for what it's worth, I've been watching you work for 3 years. Whatever this is, you've handled it correctly. I said, thank you, Amara. She left. I sat at my desk and looked at the magnolia tree in the courtyard. It was February. It was blooming as it always bloomed in February, as though the temperature were a matter of personal indifference. My phone rang that evening. My personal phone, the number I had never given to Daniela, which meant she had gotten it from my mother. I let it ring. Then I listened to the voicemail. She said, Val, I don't understand what's happening. Craig looked you up online. It says you're the chief here. Since last year. How long have you been? I don't understand why you never told us. Mom doesn't know. I haven't told her yet. I think we need to talk. I think there's a lot we need to talk about. The thing with the house, Ernesto has been handling it, and I don't think it's been handled right, and now that I know if you're the chief of a hospital, you probably know lawyers. Real lawyers. Anyway, call me. The thing with the house. I sat with that phrase for a while. Our mother's house. The house in Fresno where I had been told I was not going to medical school. The house my father had paid a mortgage on for 9 years before he died. The house my mother had lived in for 34 years and which, as I had learned from Camilla in a phone call the previous autumn, my brother Ernesto had begun the process of placing in his own name through a mechanism that Camilla described as some kind of trust thing, and which she did not fully understand. I understood it. I had understood it since Camilla's call in September. I had spent the week since that call doing something Daniela would not have anticipated. I had been thorough. I called Margaret Osaibansu that evening, not about the billing dispute that had been resolved 3 years earlier, about my mother's house, about trust documents, about the specific legal question of whether a property transfer executed while the transferring party has a documented cognitive decline. My mother's diabetes had, in the past 18 months, begun to affect her more significantly than any of us had acknowledged, could be challenged on grounds of undue influence. Margaret listened. She asked 12 questions, each one more specific than the last. Then she said, "I'm going to refer you to a colleague. Her name is Patricia Nwasu. She's an estate attorney. Best I know in Sacramento, you call her Monday." I called Patricia Nwasu on Monday. I signed the first document on Wednesday. There was no going back. Patricia Nwasu of the firm Ademi and Nwasu, Elder Law and Estate Litigation, was 63 years old, 5 feet 2 inches, and had the focused patience of someone who had watched families destroy each other over property for 4 decades, and had decided that the only useful response was precision. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she took notes on yellow legal pads in handwriting so small I needed to lean forward to read it. In our second meeting, in her office on K Street in Sacramento, she said, "Walk me through what you know about the property transfer." I walked her through it. Ernesto had persuaded our mother to sign documents in June of the previous year that transferred the Fresno house into a revocable trust with himself as sole trustee. The stated rationale was Medicaid planning. The actual effect, Patricia explained, was that control of the property's disposition now rested entirely with Ernesto, while our mother retained occupancy rights but no ownership authority. Simone had said when I told her, "That's not Medicaid planning, that's an inheritance grab." Patricia said the same thing, in more specific legal terms. She said there were 3 grounds on which this could be challenged: the adequacy of my mother's capacity to consent at the time of signing, the independence of the legal counsel my mother had been provided, if any, and the financial disclosure provided to my mother about the consequences of the transfer. "Did she have her own attorney?" Patricia asked. I said, "I don't know." Patricia said, "Find out." I called Camilla. Camilla said she did not think there had been an attorney. She said Ernesto had brought papers and their mother had signed them at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table. I reported this to Patricia. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right. I'm going to need a copy of the trust documents, your mother's medical records from the past 2 years documenting the progression of her cognitive symptoms, and any financial records you can access that show the property's value and your mother's understanding of that value." Medical records. I was the chief of a pediatric department, not my mother's physician, and I had no access to her records. But I knew the system. I knew who to call and what the process was and how to support my mother in formally requesting her own records and authorizing their release to Patricia. My mother did not fully understand what was happening. I explained it to her on a phone call in late November, carefully, without alarm. I said, "Ernesto has control of your house, Mom. That might not be what you intended. I want to make sure you're protected." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He told me it was so the government couldn't take it." I said, "I know, but there's a process to make sure it was done right. Will you let me help?" She said, "You're helping." I said, "I'm helping." She said, "Valentina, you're my good girl." I did not cry on that call, I cried after it. I told Simone, over coffee in her kitchen, she had retired in December and lived 12 minutes from the hospital in a house full of plants and medical journals, and an elderly dog named Brisket, about the call. She listened with her hands around her mug, and when I finished she said, "Are you sure about what you're doing?" "Not legally, morally." I said I had been asking myself that for 2 months. She said, "And," I said, "my mother signed documents she didn't understand with no independent counsel while she has a documented cognitive condition. My brother has sole control of her home. That's not something I can watch happen." Simone said, "No, it isn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What about Daniela?" I said, "Daniela is calling me about lawyers. She doesn't know what I've already done." Simone looked at me over her mug. "She's about to find out that you've been 2 steps ahead of this since September." I said, "Yes." She said, "How do you feel about that?" I considered the question with the same honesty I tried to bring to clinical decisions. I said, "Steady." She nodded slowly. "Steady," she said. "All right." That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. In the first week of January, 2 weeks before Daniel's emergency admission, though I did not know that was coming, Patricia Nwasu filed a formal challenge to the trust transfer in Sacramento County Superior Court, citing lack of independent legal counsel, inadequate financial disclosure, and the documented progression of my mother's type 2 diabetes, and its associated cognitive effects as evidence that her capacity to provide informed consent to the transfer required judicial review. The filing named Ernesto as respondent. He did not call me, he called Daniela. Daniela called Camilla. Camilla called me, she said, Val, what is happening? Ernesto is furious, he's saying you filed something at a courthouse. I said, I retained an estate attorney to ensure Mom's interests are protected with respect to the Fresno property, that's accurate. Camilla said, why didn't you tell us? I said, because I wanted to make sure the filing was correct before I said anything. It is. Camilla was quiet. Then she said, is this because of the money, the insurance money from when Dad died? I said, it's because our mother signed documents she may not have fully understood, without her own attorney, and I want a court to confirm that what happened was in her best interest. Camilla said, Val. I said, yes. She said, I'm glad you're doing this. I said I knew. Patricia Nwasu was filing a motion for financial disclosure from Ernesto regarding all transactions involving the property and any funds associated with the trust. The hearing was scheduled for March 14th. The filing was done and witnessed, and the process was in motion, and Ernesto now knew that I was not the same person who had sat silently at the kitchen table in Fresno, while a $94,000 life insurance payout was distributed without her. She had 2 more days before Daniel's emergency admission changed the geometry of everything. On February 8th, Daniela called my office directly. She had gotten the number from the hospital's department directory. My administrative assistant, a meticulous woman named Gloria Ibarra who had been in the department since before I arrived, put her through with a note that said, your sister, personal call. I picked up. Daniela said, I need you to understand that I didn't know what Ernesto was doing with Mom's house. I want you to know that. I said, all right. She said, he told me it was Medicaid planning. He said it was for Mom. I said, I know what he told people. Said, Craig thinks you have a strong case. He looked at the filing online. He said the financial disclosure issue alone is, I said, Craig is right. She paused. Then she said, I've been talking to Mom. She's confused about a lot of it. She said she didn't know she was giving up ownership. I said, that's consistent with what the medical records indicate about her condition at the time of signing. Another pause. Longer. Daniela said, I told her you were helping. I said, I know, she told me. Daniela said, Val, I know I said things back then. When you were at Fresno State and you wanted to go to medical school, I said things that I shouldn't have. I kept my hands flat on the desk. I looked at the window. The magnolia tree was at the edge of my sightline, white flowers against a gray February sky. I said, I know. She said, I didn't think you'd actually do it. I didn't think, I said, Daniela, your son is being discharged tomorrow morning. Dr. Johansson will review his discharge instructions with you and Craig. He has a follow-up specialist appointment in 4 weeks. Please make sure you keep it. She was quiet. I said, I'll be at the March 14th hearing. She thought she had understood something. She had 3 more weeks. The hearing on March 14th at Sacramento County Superior Court was assigned to Judge Renata Oduya, a woman of 57 who had presided over elder law cases for 9 years, and who ran her courtroom with the particular efficiency of someone who had heard every version of every family dispute and had decided that the cleanest path through all of them was documentation. The courtroom held 42 seats in the gallery. They were full. Patricia Nwasu had advised me that the hearing would likely draw family. It drew all of them, Ernesto and his wife, Cecilia, with their attorney, a man named Dale Hutchins of Hutchins and Mercer who specialized in trust and estate work and who walked into the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had reviewed the filing and decided it was manageable. Daniela and Craig, seated apart from Ernesto, which I noted. Camilla, who had driven from Fresno the night before and who sat in the second row of the gallery and nodded at me when I walked in. Also present, Patricia Nwasu, with 3 folders of documentation on the table in front of her. Margaret Osaibansu, who had been retained as co-counsel for the medical records and insurance policy questions associated with my mother's care. Dr. Evelyn Carrasco, who was my mother's primary care physician and who had agreed to provide written testimony regarding my mother's documented cognitive symptoms in the 18 months preceding the trust signing. And my mother herself, Rosa Reyes, 71 years old, seated in the row directly behind our table in a blue coat I had not seen before, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the back of my head with an expression I did not see until I turned to acknowledge her arrival. At which point she reached out and took my hand and held it for a moment, and then let go. Ernesto's attorney opened with a straightforward argument. The transfer was executed under competent legal guidance. It represented standard Medicaid planning practice, and the challenge was a family dispute being litigated at public expense. He was measured. He used the word straightforward 4 times in 7 minutes. He said the trust documents were clear, the transfer was clean, and the petitioner had no standing to challenge a voluntary transfer executed by a competent adult. Patricia Nwasu said, "Your Honor, the petitioner will demonstrate that 3 conditions for informed consent were not met at the time of the transfer. We will show that the respondent's legal guidance was not independent. The attorney who prepared the documents had a prior business relationship with the respondent. We will show that the financial disclosure provided to the transferring party was materially incomplete. And we will show through medical records that the transferring party's capacity to evaluate complex legal documents was compromised at the time of signing." She placed the first document on the table and slid a copy toward the respondent's side. "That was the first document. I had 3 more. Dale Hutchins looked at the document. He looked at his client. Ernesto, in my peripheral vision, had the expression of a man who has opened a door expecting a closet and found a staircase going somewhere he did not plan to go." Patricia began. The first document was a letter from the attorney who had prepared the trust documents, a man named Frank Garfield, who operated a solo practice in Fresno, acknowledging a prior business relationship with Ernesto Reyes that consisted of 2 prior contracted legal matters in 2019 and 2020, 3 years before the trust transfer. Patricia did not call this fraud. She called it a failure of independent representation. She noted that Frank Garfield had not advised Rosa Reyes to seek separate counsel. She noted that the trust documents contained no attestation that the transferring party had been offered that opportunity. Judge Oduya said, "Was Mrs. Reyes advised of her right to retain independent counsel before signing?" Dale Hutchins said, "The transfer was voluntary, Your Honor." Judge Oduya said, "That's not what I asked." Hutchins paused. He looked at his papers. He said, "There is no attestation in the documents to that effect." The judge made a note. The second document was Dr. Evelyn Carrasco's written testimony. It was 11 pages. It documented, in the specific and referenced language of a physician who had been treating my mother for 6 years, the progressive effects of type 2 diabetes on my mother's executive function, short-term memory, and capacity to process complex multi-step information. Effects that were measurably present in the neuropsychological evaluation conducted in April of the year of the trust signing, 2 months before the documents were executed. The evaluation had been conducted at my mother's clinic. It was part of her medical records. It had been in the file the whole time. Ernesto had not known it existed. I knew it existed because I had asked my mother, carefully and specifically, about her recent clinic visits, and she had mentioned the evaluation in passing, and I had helped her request her own medical records and authorize their release to Patricia Nwasu. Dale Hutchins said, "We would object to the introduction of medical records without the patient's." Patricia said, "The patient is present, Your Honor, and has signed a release authorizing the use of these records in this proceeding. We have the signed release." Judge Oduya said, "Objection overruled." I heard Cecilia, Ernesto's wife, say something to him in a low voice. I could not hear the words. I heard his response, which was 3 syllables, and which he said with his jaw tight. The third document was a financial disclosure statement prepared by Celia Park, my financial advisor at Meridian Wealth Partners, who had assessed the current fair market value of the Fresno property, $387,000, based on comparable sales in the neighborhood, and cross-referenced it with the disclosure statement provided to my mother at the time of the trust signing, which had stated the property value as $220,000. That figure was the assessed value from a county tax record 4 years old. It was not the market value. The discrepancy was $167,000. I watched Daniela, across the courtroom, receive that number. She turned and looked at Craig. Craig's face was careful and still in the way of someone calculating something they do not want to be calculating. Patricia said, "Mrs. Reyes was provided with a materially inaccurate representation of the asset value at the time she was asked to sign the transfer documents. A $167,000 undervaluation of the primary asset in question is not a clerical discrepancy. It is a material omission that would affect any competent adult's ability to evaluate the true consequence of the transfer." Given the additional question of Mrs. Reyes's documented cognitive status, The combination of these failures constitutes grounds for the court to set aside the transfer and restore the property to Mrs. Reyes's direct ownership, with appropriate legal oversight going forward. Dale Hutchins said, "Your Honor, this is," Judge Oduya said, "Mr. Hutchins, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to each element in sequence. But I want to tell you that based on what I have seen this morning, this court has significant concerns about the process by which this transfer was executed." Ernesto stood up. His attorney put a hand on his arm. He sat down. The fourth document was a packet of financial disclosures that Patricia had obtained through discovery, 3 months of Ernesto's personal financial records, subpoenaed as part of the proceeding. They showed that in the 8 months following the trust transfer, Ernesto had taken out a home equity line of credit against the Fresno property in the amount of $48,000. The property he had no legal right to use as collateral without the trustee authority he had given himself through the transfer. The room, which had been quiet, became quieter. This is the kind of quiet that has a specific texture. It is not the quiet of people being polite. It is the quiet of people recalibrating. Daniela looked at me. I was looking at Patricia. I did not return Daniela's look. Not because I was punishing her, because there was nothing I needed from her expression right now, and there was nothing I wanted her to read from mine. The work was being done. The documents were speaking. That was what I had built. That was what was happening. Judge Oduya said, "The court will take a 45-minute recess." In the corridor outside the courtroom, Camilla found me and stood close and said quietly, "You knew about the equity line." I said, "Patricia found it in discovery." Camilla said, "He borrowed against Mom's house." I said, "Yes." She said, "Val," just my name, the way she had said it when we were children and something had frightened her. I said, "It's being handled." Margaret Osaibansu appeared at my elbow and handed me a coffee and said, in her efficient and direct way, "Patricia is moving for a complete reversal of the transfer and a conservatorship assessment for your mother's financial affairs. She's also flagging the equity line to the court as potential financial elder abuse." I said, "I know." Margaret said, "How are you doing?" I thought about the question. I said, "I'm exactly where I plan to be." She studied my face for a moment. Then she said, "That's either very healthy or very concerning." "I haven't decided which." I said, "Probably both." When court reconvened, Dale Hutchins had a different affect. Less measured. The documents had done what documents do when they are correct and complete and properly presented. They had shifted the ground under the other side's argument. He attempted to reframe the financial disclosure issue as an honest error in valuation. He attempted to characterize the equity line as a temporary borrowing against an asset the trust was legally authorized to leverage. He attempted to argue that the neuropsychological evaluation in the medical records was a screening tool, not a clinical determination of incapacity. Judge Oduya addressed each point in turn. She was not unkind. She was also not persuadable. At the close of the hearing, Judge Oduya issued 3 rulings from the bench. First, the property transfer was set aside, pending a full judicial review of the process, with the property reverting to my mother's direct ownership for the duration of the review. Second, a court-appointed independent attorney would be assigned to represent my mother's interests going forward. Third, the matter of the $48,000 equity line was referred to the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office for assessment under California's Elder Financial Abuse Statute. She said, "This court takes very seriously its responsibility to protect vulnerable adults from financial exploitation by family members." The documentation presented today raises questions that require answers beyond the scope of this hearing. I expect full compliance from all parties with any subsequent inquiry. Ernesto's face, when I finally looked at it, was a specific kind of pale, the pale of someone who has understood that what they believed was a manageable situation has become something with a name in a statute, with a referral to a district attorney with a court record. His wife was looking at her hands. His attorney was making notes with the compressed efficiency of someone who is already thinking about the next filing. Daniela was not looking at Ernesto. She was looking at me, and her expression was not what I expected. It was not anger, and it was not the complicated shame I had anticipated, and it was not the particular look of someone recalibrating their estimation of a person they had once dismissed. It was something quieter than all of those things. It was the look of someone who is very tired and has been carrying something she did not name and is watching it finally be named by someone else. I looked at her. I held her gaze. I did not smile and I did not nod and I did not perform anything. I just looked at her, the way one adult looks at another when they are in the same room with the same facts, and there is nothing left to pretend. Then I picked up my bag, and I thanked Patricia Nwasu, and I walked out of the courtroom into a Sacramento afternoon in March that was cold and bright and completely unremarkable. I drove back to Harrowfield Children's Medical Center. I went to my office. I sat at my desk. The magnolia tree in the courtyard had already peaked, the way it always peaked too early, and some of the white flowers were beginning to brown at the edges. I looked at it for a long time. Then I opened my email, and I responded to 7 departmental items that had accumulated during the morning, including an approval request from Dr. Kevin Patel regarding a new clinical protocol for infant RSV management that was, in my assessment, excellent work, and deserved a prompt approval. I sent the approval at 3:14 in the afternoon. That was the day. In the months that followed, the judicial review of the trust transfer concluded in my mother's favor. The property was restored to her direct ownership. A court-appointed attorney named Sylvia Tamura was assigned to oversee my mother's financial affairs going forward, with a specific mandate to review any future transfers or agreements before execution. Ernesto entered into a legal settlement with the court that required full repayment of the $48,000 equity line, with interest, to my mother's estate, and the Sacramento County DA's office closed its assessment without criminal charges after Ernesto's attorney negotiated a repayment agreement. It was not prosecuted. The repayment schedule was structured over 5 years and is being monitored by Sylvia Tamura's office. That is the outcome. I find it proportional. He did not go to prison. He did have to give the money back. My mother has her house. Daniela and I have spoken several times since March. The conversations are careful, the way conversations are when people are rebuilding something that was not built correctly the first time and know they have to be precise about the foundation. She told me in October that she has been seeing a therapist. Her word was therapist, delivered without the flinching quality it sometimes carries, to work through what she described as a lot of things she had buried about our family and our father's death and the ways she had handled the years that followed. I told her that sounded like important work. I meant it. She asked in that same call whether I thought there was a path back to something like a real relationship. I told her I didn't know. I told her I was willing to find out. I told her that the only condition I had ever had was that she be honest with me, and that if she could do that, I was willing to show up. She said she could do that. I said I would hold her to it. My mother is stable. Her diabetes management has improved since she began seeing a specialist, Dr. Priya Anand, at a clinic in Fresno that Patricia Nwasu's office helped us identify as one of the best in the region. The therapy sessions she does with a social worker through her primary care practice have helped her process the events of the past year. She calls me on Tuesdays now, not just holidays. We talk about ordinary things and occasionally about extraordinary ones. She called me on a Tuesday in November and said, "Valentina, the chief of a hospital, I should have known." I said, "You did know, Mom. You said I was your practical one." She laughed. She had a good laugh, my mother, she still does. I am 39 years old. I am chief of pediatrics at Harrowfield Children's Medical Center. My department has 32 physicians now. Dr. Johansson recruited a talented young pulmonologist from Boston last spring, who has already submitted a research proposal that I expect will be funded. I continue to take clinical shifts in the pediatric emergency department on evenings when we need coverage, not because I am required to, but because I believe a chief who does not still put her hands on patients loses something essential over time, and I am not willing to lose it. I have a house in Elk Grove. Not the investment property. I sold that in September and used the equity to buy a house with a backyard and a room I use as a study. Celia Park called it the most disciplined asset reallocation she had seen from a client under 45. I told her that was because I had been practicing discipline since I was 17. Dr. Simone Beaumont comes for dinner on the second Sunday of every month. She brings wine and opinions and the dog. We talk about the department, about medicine, about what is changing and what will not change no matter how much changes. She said to me last month, "You know what the actual story is. It's not the confrontation. It's not the hearing. It's the 22 years between the kitchen table and room 4. I said, "I know." She said, "Most people don't have 22 years of silence in them." I said, "Most people weren't trained on necessity." She considered that. Then she said, "No, they weren't. I think about my father sometimes. Not with grief exactly, though grief is in it. With the particular tenderness that people feel for those who were not able to see what came after. He would have understood what I built. He built things too, not buildings exactly, but conditions. He built the condition of a family that believed in doing the next correct thing quietly, without announcement, and letting the accumulation speak for itself. I got that from him. I kept it when everything else was taken. I want to be honest with you about one thing before I close. When I walked into room 4 at 2:47 in the morning and I saw my sister and I saw her son, and I saw what his oxygen saturation was doing, I did not feel satisfaction. I want to be clear about that because the story could be told in a way where the reunion is a kind of victory lap, and it was not. It was a child in respiratory distress. It was my sister frightened in the way that parents are frightened when the fear has no floor. Those things were real, and they mattered more than anything I had built or planned or proved. I took excellent care of her son. That was not a statement. It was just what I did. And if there is anything this experience taught me, it is this. 1. What you build in silence is protected from the interference of people who would have dismantled it if they had seen it coming. Patience is not passivity, it is a form of engineering. 2. Documentation is not bureaucracy, it is memory with legal standing, the records, the filings, the signed agreements. The medical files are the difference between a story only you can tell and a story the world can verify. 3. Who you become is not determined by who your family expected you to be. It is determined by the work you do in the hours when no one is watching and no one is applauding, and the only reason you are still at your desk is because you decided, once, that you were worth believing in. Was I wrong to keep my position at Harrowfield secret from my family for 11 months, while a legal case concerning my mother was already in motion? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.